for today and for the Grounded Festival. We are very happy to welcome Majd Nasrallah, who arrived 2 days ago from Palestine, to be here with us today and talk about one of the most pressing issues that has been daily going on as one of the main questions in our geographical spaces in the Balkans, or extending Balkan regions as well. Majd Nasrallah is going to be talking about why the Palestinian statehood is not the solution, contrary to what we've been advocating in these geographies for the Palestinians. And Majd is a researcher, cultural worker, and practitioner who's been beautifully vocal about different political sensitivities and political issues with regard to the Palestinian question and the ongoing genocide. And I very much admire his divine force and strength to be here with us and to talk with us with so much patience. And I really feel that Majd is one of the political educators of today, and we are so privileged to have him in our space. So this was just a brief introduction. I'll give Majd the mic, and then I'll come back later to do a bit of a Q&A with you and with the audience.
Hello, salam to everyone. Thank you, Emina, for this brilliant introduction. I don't know if I deserve all of it. And thank you for the people at Grounded for organizing this very important event. Just before we start, I wanted to bring us back to reality, because sometimes it's hard, or sometimes it slips our mind why we're here. And I just want to say, if you can please join me for a moment of silence for the lives of 40,000 martyrs that have been taken unjustly, and tens of thousands of martyrs that have gone in the last 76 years. Thank you. Thank you. Similar to what the comrades said earlier, I would have preferred this to be a conversation as opposed to a monologue. So please, not take notes, but I would really love it if we open the floor later to kind of reflect on some of the ideas that will be posed here, and just an exchange of knowledge on how we can actually build upon some of these ideas. You see, in the last 10 months, I've been, all of us have witnessed various forms of actions for solidarity, effectively trying to stop the genocide right now, asking for a ceasefire. And we could see across the board, whether it be student movements, whether it's, workers, unions, or whatever it may be, trying to pressure the government or just protest or create disruptions. To be honest, we haven't really been successful. I mean, let's be real. We know the analysis. It seems 10 months in, it's very clear what the situation is, and it can be very distressing to continue speaking to people as if we have to prove the humanity of this cause, or that we have to somehow prove to people why this is just, or why this is a just struggle, and it seems that we're still caught up in this kind of a predicament where we're still trying to negate the narrative, and I think in part, I mean, not only is that not constructive and keeps us in a certain loop, but I think in part it's because we don't have an end game in mind, because ceasefire is a necessary step to be taken right now to save lives, but what after, right? What are we working for? And as a Palestinian, I would have to admit that a big part of that is the shortcoming of Palestinians themselves. We haven't, given the world a very clear project to stand behind. We look across the board and we see, you have BDS, right? And BDS it's not really saying what the political solution could be. It's asking you to boycott, divest, and to sanction. Meanwhile, you know, the Palestinian political parties don't really endorse BDS, right? So it's still a civil society kind of call for action, which is not complemented on the political front. And then, you know, there's all these fragmentation of what the Palestinian political map looks like. You know, you have the Palestinians in 48, which are still stuck up in, do we, you know, participate in the parliament? Do we, you know, do we stay outside of the parliament? Then you have, you know, in the West Bank, there's still this echelon of the political non-democratically present factions, which are also still caught up in their own kind of internal struggles, Fatah and Hamas. And East Jerusalem is almost non-existent in the political context, and then you have, you know, masses of the youth who are also in Palestine, unable to participate in any political project. And so I chose to speak on why Palestinian statehood isn't the answer, specifically in Slovenia, because you know, Slovenia was one of the states that has recently recognized Palestine, and this was, among the other states, was ushered as a win, which in many cases it is, given the political framework right now. But it can be a disillusioning or maybe even misdirected kind of conception of what success is, or what it implies to have that recognition. So I wanted to speak on that briefly today. I had a bit of, you know, I thought how I would outline this conversation. And I think, you know, I just want to take us in a few steps. I would like to address, first of all, the context of what statehood is, right? And, you know, I want to get into a bit of what the Palestinian Revolution was in the 60s until early 90s, touch upon Oslo and why, you know, from there try to get to why Palestinian statehood isn't the answer. So to begin with, let's not forget that the notion of statehood, of nation states, was something that was coined in Europe, in colonial Europe. It was some kind of political format that regulated the relationships of different European powers amongst each other, and how they divided up their territories, what kind of governmentality looked like, and their relations between each other developed later to become an arm, let's say, of colonial practice across the world, and how they divided up different states for wealth accumulation. And so it's a bit, yani, when we take that and try to apply it post-World War II, where only 41% of today's states were states, and the rest of the world was not states. It was this transition from empire into this new global order, carrying with it the legacy of colonialism. It was very costly for European states at the time to maintain territorial control of the colonies, and hence there was this kind of ingenious way of creating proxy states, right, modeled on European 19th century nation state forms. And in this case, when we try to apply that you know, I'm vehemently against the term Middle East, because it's always like middle of what and east to who. But if we try to apply, if we try to apply that to the Middle East, the Mashriq Maghrib, as I call it, we can begin to understand that these colonial infrastructures were pretty much based on European interest in the region. So most of the states, the Arab states that existed, the borders were drawn up practically for oil pipelines and the division of, you know, what France and Britain at the time wanted from the region. And in this case, we begin to see that we can start to kind of have a critical lens to what Arab nationalisms represented, right? And what it means to create all these micro Arab nationalities, Jordanian, Egyptian, Syrian, Tunisian, etc., and to kind of, at the time, for many of these states, they wanted to become players in this new world order, right? This world created by, post World War II by the United Charters as, as what a state is. And it became kind of the only go-to in terms of conceptualizing governmentality, territory, population control, and so on and so forth. And the reason I say this is because when Zionism came into the picture, it was infused within trying to divide this location up. And at the time, and to go into what Palestinian revolution represented, it was clear to most people that this state is one that is not natural, right? It's an alien entity that came from a foreign land into indigenous land and dispossessed the people. So if we look at 48 up until the early 90s, the values of the Palestinian revolution or the movement for liberation were not for statehood. They were against Zionism as a force that dispossessed the people, as a force that unjustly took land and territory, as a force that massacred multiple masses, right? And these values kind of gave weight to the Palestinian question within the given context at the time, because other states in the global south primarily were able to create affinity with the Palestinian struggle because they were able to see, the non-aligned movement at the time was able to place the Palestinian struggle within its anti-imperialist agendas, right? And so it became clear, when we ask ourselves, why would the Japanese Red Army at the time be part of the Palestinian struggle? And it was because they conceptualized the struggle as an anti-imperialist struggle. They saw Israel as an imperialist outpost at the time, and they saw that it was an extension of empire in its new forms, right? And it gets tricky over there, because when we arrive to the first Intifada and we look at the reasons why the Intifada came to being, is because people were facing military occupation. Right? There was no political formations in the West Bank at the time, and most of the political parties of the PLO were outside of Palestine. They were outside of the West Bank, and the people went in they manifested this uprising because they wanted emancipation. They wanted liberation from an occupying force. They were not about creating a state per se, right? And so when the Intifada reached its peak, it was very clear for Israel at the time that there's no one to speak to, right? And that they needed another body, another partner, to kind of quell the Palestinian revolution and to have some form of control over these populations, right? If we remember, between 48 and 67, the West Bank and Gaza were respectively with Jordan and Egypt, right? So it wasn't about political rights per se at the time, because that would have manifested in citizenship for both, and it would have been okay. Why have a Palestinian state? And so in that line, in that vein, the trajectory of Oslo was the one where liberation it was split away into this notion of statehood, or building state. And it's important to note here that began with something that was fundamentally flawed, in which the negotiations between Israel and what soon became the PA, or the Palestinian Authority, was grounded on a recognition by the Palestinians of the legitimacy of Israeli sovereignty. Meanwhile, the Israelis recognized the Palestinian Authority. They didn't recognize a Palestinian self-determination as such. And that phase was meant to be an interim in which the Palestinian Authority would soon be given the privilege of creating a state. And from there, there's two things to consider when we think about Palestinian statehood and why it's not viable, right? And the first being, clearly, logistically, on the ground, it doesn't exist, right? We're talking, the Oslo Accords divided up the West Bank, which is 22% only of historic Palestine, into three geographic, legal statuses. One being Area A, in which the Palestinian Authority has administrative and, let's say, security control, which is about 7% of the West Bank and about 2 or 3% of historic Palestine. And then you have Area B, where the Israeli army has military control and the PA is meant to have administrative control. And then you have more than 63% of the West Bank, which is the compromise of historic Palestine, which is completely under Israeli control. I mean, all of it is under the military establishment or military apparatus of Israel. And since '93 up until today, there has been an increase of almost 1 million settlers that are in the West Bank currently, right? And what that implies is that the geography of the West Bank has been, the infrastructure created, has been there to serve and create this connection between the West Bank and Israel, Israel proper. And if you visit, and for those who visited, apart from the checkpoints, which restrict the movement of Palestinians, it's practically, you don't feel that you're exiting a space to another space unless you go into Area B. And the Palestinian state, as it's being proposed, is one that is devoid of security, one that is devoid of resources, currency, among other things. And on the ground, it basically creates a system of Bantustans, right? Self-regulated spaces in which it's practically impractical. There's no such thing as a state that could ever be created on the model of modern state or nation-state situation. Sorry, but what's more important to think about is what Oslo effectively also fundamentally changed or cemented was the legal fragmentation, the political fragmentation of the Palestinian population. So if we look at the Oslo Accords, we will see that there's zero mention of the Palestinian citizens in Israel, which are almost 1.8 million. It also had almost no reference directly to 7 million Palestinians abroad. And what that means is, automatically, more than half of the Palestinian nation is now not part of the political decision-making of what Palestine is. And that, I think, to me, is one of the most central and significant aspects to think about when we talk about statehood. It's on the one front, not only is it impractical, on the other front, it's, in terms of its values, doesn't represent what the Palestinian plight for emancipation or liberation looks like, right? Because Palestinians, at essence, as I said earlier, were negating or were fighting or resisting the notion of Zionism as a supremacist mentality, as a settler colonial project that was alien to the region. And what this implies is when you recognize a Palestinian state, given these conditions, you're basically legitimizing Israel. You're giving Israel a free pass as a normal state in the region. You're saying Zionism is okay, and now Palestine is just a question of borders, and not a question of values, not a question of the freedom of the person, right? Or freedom as such, emancipation or liberation. And not only are you legitimizing this entity, right? You're also absolving it of its entire record of violations, of its entire history of these abuses of land disposition, of killing, of genocide, of apartheid, etc. And it's very demeaning, because now suddenly you're at the whims of your colonizer, like, please can I have my liberation? And that's not what liberation is supposed to look like. You know, you don't beg for liberation. No one's doing you a favor by letting you stay where you are and giving you some form of governance or some form of integrity of being an indigenous person in that land. And so when we account all of, you know, when we see the amalgamation or when we bring all these factors together, it becomes clear that Palestinian statehood only serves, or the plight or the mission of Palestinian statehood as the European systems are proposing is actually serving Israel. It's giving Israel a free pass to go, but it's also would be a hoax on the ground. It would not, you know, it would not fundamentally be something viable, right? And this is not to mention that the Palestinian Authority in its organizational form is not a democratic one. It's one that didn't represent the Palestinian Intifada, and the people that were part of the uprising, the forces that mobilized on the ground in 87 up until 91 or 92 did not call for statehood again, right? And they were not part of the political factions that came back and negotiated with Israel. And so the demands or the requests of the people were not part of this agreement. Hence, for the last 30 years, the people in these factions or in positions of power were not democratically elected. And each time there would be a democratic election, I mean, let's forget about 2006 and what happened and how Hamas is now in Gaza, is not a representative. In a critical lens, in a very objective lens actually, you begin to see that the PA is doing Israel's dirty work. And since the genocide started, it has been the force that has quelled Palestinian resistance in the West Bank. They're the ones that are arresting the resistance fighter and, you know, handing them over to the Israeli security apparatus. It's been they have been the body that has really been trained. Mind you, there's 70,000 members of the Palestinian Authority, militants, that have only been trained to restrict protests and mobilizations. They have been trained by the CIA and by the US multiple times, whether it's Dayton in the Second Intifada or whether it was the Aqaba Summit just 2 years ago, practically to oppress Palestinians from ever mobilizing on the ground and trying to threaten the security of the State of Israel. And it's also important to note that when the project of statehood was proposed in '93, it came after a significant change in world politics, which is the fall of the USSR and the soaring of neoliberal world philosophy, if we may call it that, right? And so, in that sense, the entire ethos of the PA in creating a state became about building institutions that mirrored capitalist values. It was suddenly about erecting businesses. It was suddenly about privatizing markets. It was suddenly about, you know, having banks that give loans. It was suddenly about creating urban areas for development, not for the refugees, but for the, you know. And this created a deeper wedge in terms of also the classist struggle, because suddenly you have all these, you know, businessmen that have, you know, become so affluent, who don't want to liberate Palestine because their interests are aligned with capitalism, right? And, you know, with that being said, the last thing that, you know, that was proposed is, you know, it's the cherry on top of this, or it's the most blatant of this equation, which was Trump's deal of the century. And the basic premise of the deal of the century is forget self-determination. Don't talk about sovereignty, but here, take all this money. We'll give you a port in Haifa. We'll give you an airport in Dimona. We'll open up more opportunity for the business class to become more, to become wealthier, and so on and so forth. And so, given these contexts, and in my opinion, when we talk about statehood, this is a compromise on what the Palestinian struggle is about. Again, a struggle for emancipation, liberation, and freedom. And so, to bring this to a close, because the questions are, okay, if it's not statehood, right, what do you want? For a long time, or for a while, I used to believe in the one democratic state. And I used to coordinate the one democratic state campaign, believing that it's the best solution, if you may. It's the most just solution given the context, right? Dismantle Zionist institutions, create a constitution, a constitutional democracy that drafts out laws or gives rights to individuals, collectives, and so on and so forth. But then it was also a bit kind of self-negating for me, because the question was, if the start of statehood or nation state in the region was the legacy of colonial control, then why am I recycling freedom in Palestine based on British mandate? What would it mean that you create a free Palestine in an unfree region? And so I got to the conclusion with myself, and this is something that I work on constantly. It's this understanding that for Palestine to be free, the entire region has to be free. And for the entire region to be free, we have to be brave enough to propose new forms of governmentality and to shift away our focus from using the same tools used for our oppression in international forums, in international institutions, and move away from that, and not speak to that anymore, not try to fight. We've been speaking, these last 2 days about, media bias, and we've been talking about, how the international court systems are so impotent in having any form of concrete results, and so on and so forth. And if we continue to use that language, and if we continue to revolve around these frameworks, we are still controlled. We're going to run around in loops, and we're not really going to have any achievements, because we're still using the same language of our oppression. And it would be delusional of us to continue to resort to these instruments that are subtly, or actually not even subtly, very clearly used to oppress us even further. And so I say all of this to instigate people to be daring in thinking of proposing new radical propositions, to actually believe in having an imagination, to dare to have an imagination. Let's think otherwise. Let's think, what would it mean to recreate or to propose our own forms of governmentality in the region? What would it mean to move away from nation states and to create new infrastructure that builds for the prosperity, builds for security, builds for the growth of the region? And I know, to some it does seem like a pipe dream in some senses, right? It's like, this is how can we move away from this? And this is all topic for discussions. What would it mean for mass mobilization across the region? What would it mean to propose a new project of the human? What the new human and personifies in terms of their values and morality? What societies can look like, not in mirroring European values, not in mirroring, capitalist values, and so on and so forth. And I think we have the ability, we have the strength, and we actually have the obligation to do so. Just to be daring to imagine, just to get out of this framework and think about other things. And so I want to open up the discussion. I want to, this is not something that, again, is supposed to be a monologue. This is, I think for the first instance, when I speak to a lot of people, it seems completely out of reach. It seems like something that is, just in the realm of like, imagination, but imagination that is not applicable. And I negate that. I don't think that's real. I think if we want to really be if we want to be honest about the cause, if we are about freedom, then we should practice that in our day-to-day, right? And we should again turn away from these frameworks and propose other ones, because we have the power to do so. And so liberation of Palestine is not in the form of a statehood, not only in the West Bank, but also not between the river and the sea, if that's seen as a radical, and you know, a lot of people say, our river to the sea, that means you want to get rid of, you know, the Jews and so on, and that's, you know, anti-Semitic and so on and so forth. And I say, no, I want Mashriq to Maghrib, like that entire region from Iraq all the way to Maghrib is so rich, and it doesn't need to continue being oppressed by proxy governments that serve the interest of Western European nations. I'll try to end with one thing. You know, that yesterday I heard, I don't know where Christine is, but yesterday we heard the chant of, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And it was like, what if it's translated into Palestinians will be free wherever they may be, right? Because the idea is, I don't want to have a political identity only based on a certain geography. I want to be free anywhere I go. And with that, I close. I'm sure I left a bunch of things out, but I hope your questions will instigate a deeper conversation. Thank you.
During the festival, we had a couple of really profound moments, and I feel this is one of those profound pedagogical moments, and ones that are mobilizing our political knowledges, maybe producing new types of knowledges, which is, I think, one of the goals of this festival. So thank you, Majd, for this powerful, thought-provoking, and in a sense also heartfelt input. And I would like to just go off of your pre-last idea around the regional liberation. And if you could speak a little bit more about, and then I'll give the mic to everyone else there. Who counts as region? I heard you from Mashriq to Maghrib, and, you know, and this space, but I do feel that we have to speak about the current betrayals that are happening in the region too. How do we liberate the region, both from the idea of the statehood and authoritarian statehood connected to capitalist interest and Western European interest, but also from this devoid from solidarity and understanding that Palestinians should be ours, or should be us, and not them?
It's a very hefty question, but I think to find an entrance into that, it's important to note that we are living in a historic moment, and we need to also be very aware. You look at Israel and you look at the U.S., and they're very clear about wanting to rearrange the map. Israel is very clear. They're not hiding this. You know, they're saying Greater Israel, the ones in government. This is not some extremists on the margins. This is mainstream policy in Israel, right? They want to occupy more. Trump came out the other time and said, "Oh, Israel is too tiny. Let's expand it." You know, this is something that they are really putting on the table. This is not some extremist speculation. They're actually sincerely thinking about this. And so in that relation, or in that on the flip side of that, I think we should be the ones like, no, yeah, let's rearrange the map, you know, but not in your way. Like, let's stop with this reactionary politics and wait for that to happen, and actually step up and be able to realize that this danger is coming. And that danger will, it would, the situation right now is horrendous. And I am sad to say that it's gonna get worse. And it sounds like it's a depressing thought to have. But that's the reality. You know, we are not in a position of power. There is no mobilizations occurring right now that have the potentiality to shift these dynamics. And if we're unprepared and if we remain passive, we will bear the grunt of this as Palestinians. They're very open about this in terms of ethnically cleansing Gaza and establishing new urban cities and industrial parks, or industrial cities and parks and so on and so forth. And they're very like open about wanting to ethnically cleanse the West Bank and get these populations out, and the ones that remain to continue consolidating their power there. And so to answer your question, I have, there's two levels, right? The first is, we speak about solidarity a lot. And the last time I was around, I was saying that solidarity is not some kind of privilege that you step out and say, hey, like, I'm a good person, I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out and stand out with the Palestinians. But if I'm tired today, I won't go. And I said that, solidarity is a sacrifice, right? You sacrifice your privilege. You sacrifice your individual privilege, the comfort provided to you by the capitalist system, to step out and see that there's this intersectionality, but shared reality that you have. So by standing up for us, you're standing up for you. And I think in the last few months, I began to rearrange that approach. And I think, if we break down the psychology of humanity, usually people are pushed to action by interest, when they have a vested interest in something. If you're hungry and you tell me that, there's a shared thing that we can do that's going to feed me, I'm probably going to do it, right? And basing, if we try to apply that to realpolitik, we start seeing that without a significant force of allyship on a section of shared interest, then it's very hard to convince people just to take action that is radical. And let's look at the state of Slovenia. There won't be an arms embargo just because we're asking for it. There will be if the state of Slovenia finds interest in having an arms embargo. And so, I'm not the person to speak on Slovenian politics, and this is speculation from afar, but if we look at corporations and states, which are basically the decision makers, corporations, capital flow, are the decision makers in this reality. The US, it would be a little off-key to think of, the U.S. elections as something that will significantly change anything, because the lobbies behind that are looking out for interest for companies like Lockheed Martin, who have an interest in this genocide continuing because they're selling weapons, so on and so forth. And so rethinking on a very pragmatic level how we can create allyships of shared interest, which, it sounds like you're compromising human values, but you're really not, right? And so that's one front. The other front, which I am personally a part of, I can't speak on the entirety of the region, but what I can say is that Palestinians themselves, we should step up and promote or propose such a project, right? We have the power to actually influence the region to think otherwise. And one powerful tool of that, and we spoke on this briefly, is popular political education. How can you work with communities in creating a new political horizon that corresponds to their realities, that instigates them to take political action because it's directly related to their lives? Again, the Palestinian Authority is not something that reflects people's politics. So there's a passivity in Palestine because there's no container guiding the Palestinian political project, right? And my approach is we need to build that from the ground up. And so I'm personally invested in working with different communities in Palestine to create from the ground up a new political philosophy, if you may, or political theory that incorporates within it a call to change in human behavior in the region and a change in perception of what political reality is. I hope that answers the question.
Let's open this up. We have very many people
So I was struggling to come up with a question to this until what you mentioned at the end, because the two parts that really stood out to me in what you talked about, one is this idea that the Oslo Accords didn't really look at Palestinians who are outside of kind of the historic Palestine, who live abroad. And then also the second idea, you know, this radical imagination of a new type of governance. And what I thought a lot about is other nations that have also, due to kind of empires and imperialism and violence and capitalism, have now had a majority of their people in the diaspora. And how if kind of this new governance could succeed in Palestine, that it would be an example and a guidance to not just to me, the region, but to other countries like the Philippines, like many countries in South America, many countries in Africa who have had to, due to the violence of Europe, have their people in diaspora. And so my question kind of becomes then, if you could talk a little bit more about what that grassroots work that you're doing right now looks like, and what are the ideas that are coming through? How do those conversations happen from kind of that, and how do you see them progressing in the next few months and years?
That hits to the heart of the conversation. And to give a holistic answer, I would have to first of all describe the political climate in Palestine, right? So as I said earlier, the West Bank first is divided into all these different geographic localities that each have a different legal kind of status. And then similarly in 48, it's also not a one identity. You have, Palestinians in the Triangle, in the Naqab, in the Galilee, not to mention that there's Druze, Muslims, Bedouins, etc. And then you have East Jerusalem, you have the occupied Julan. And I say this to say that what Israel succeeded in doing to prevent any unifying political umbrella was to create micro struggles, right? And to make each community so vested in their own struggle, and so that there is no that people are unable to see the strength of working together. So if you look at Masafir Yatta in the south of the West Bank, it's about land expropriation, right? If you look at Triangle, it's about violence and criminal culture, criminal syndicates, and so on. If you look at Jerusalem, it's about dispossession of houses. If you look at Betin, it's about water and resources. And so what eventually happens is people are so consumed by their own immediate reality that, when you come and talk to them about, these academic terms of apartheid, colonialism, whatever, if you say this to someone from Kufr Aqab, which is a town right by the wall, by the apartheid wall, separating it from Jerusalem, from Al-Quds, and you go and you talk, and he's not interested, because he lives in a social economic situation where he has to wake up at 4 a.m. to go to the checkpoint, to go into Israel, to work as an undocumented laborer, because there's no working opportunities in the West Bank, right? And so he's not the person to be frontline unless there's no way to feed his family anymore, right? And so similarly to this concept of allyship, the work that is done on the ground is trying to create a triangle of, okay, let's identify what the need of the community is, and then let's try to see how we contextualize that within the global the wider political framework. What that means, how can you understand what's happening in Masafir Yatta to what's happening in Kalansawa in terms of house demolitions or land dispossessions? What form of organizing works here in this context, and how can that create political action, right? And so I don't in this take, it's not about creating a one size fits all. It's about decentralizing organization, and it's about creating okay, you've made micro struggles, fine, we're gonna do that, but we're gonna do that understanding that there's other things occurring within the same broader aspect. So it's about political education, with communities based on their needs and trying to politicize that need by discussing broader topics. And this occurs with, you know, students from different towns, and mayors, and feminist movements, and businessmen, and all sorts. You know, it's inclusive. You know, when you go to different localities and you invite people, as someone that wants to create political social movement, but not for parliamentary reasons, right? It's not party politics, and so people are, you know, their defenses are down. They don't feel like they have to, you know, have a certain color to represent them, and so it's working. It's working in these margins because, and I'll end on this. I don't know if this answers the question, but when we talk about the micro struggles, we're also saying that there has been the mainstream hotspot. So Ramallah, the capital of Sulta, is its own kind of ecology, right? And so someone from a faraway town is gonna like significantly face troubles getting there, not only economically, but in terms of restriction of movement, etc. And so there's a class struggle that existed there. When you look at Nablus, you know, it becomes about the mainstream places, and everything else in the margins is not accounted for in terms of the political or broader political project. I hope that touched upon your question.
Yeah, my question is around the demand for recognition of Palestine. So as the Free Palestine Initiative in Croatia, that has been one of our demands, but not the top demand. And we have emphasized that it's a symbolic ask and no way solution to Palestinian freedom, or that it will end the genocide that's happening at the moment. But it is something that we're asking, and it is in Europe seen, it's ridiculous, but it is seen as something radical as well. And you mentioned from the river to the sea. This is also being now even defined in Germany. So when we look at the recognition of Palestine on the world map, the whole is in Europe. So yeah, there is an issue. And even talking to the opposition in the Croatian parliament, which is considered the most progressive, the Green Left, they say, you know, okay, this will be our top ask because this is something that we could maybe get a consensus with the rest of the opposition and could maybe push our government towards recognizing Palestine, they do not want to get on board on, you know, sanctions and embargo and so on and so on. They're just looking what is, you know, feasible, and like you said, no imagination or radical. So I guess my question is more practical. So should we completely abandon the demand to even ask for recognition of Palestine? And if so, what would be your suggestion instead of that? What should we ask?
Can we take another question or two? Maybe they are relational.
Okay, thank you much. I'm gonna try to do the relational question like you asked. So going back to the question of recognition of Palestine, which really been a top demand also in Slovenia for quite some time. I'm wondering if you can see how that might be in certain circumstances, not necessarily to do good, but might actually do harm. I'm just going to draw a bit on the history, for example, of apartheid South Africa. For those of you who are familiar with this history, apartheid South Africa in the 1970s had this idea that they're going to preserve the democratic facade by imagining these new Bantustans. Bantustans were this kind of imaginary states that they created in territories of townships of black South Africans, where they said, okay, we're going to preserve our democracy by saying those people belong to a different state, and they actually built those parliaments for those fake states. They built them police forces, they built them stadiums and all of that. The only country actually to ever recognize any of those Bantustans was Israel, by the way. But it's just the idea, right? And then the demands of the anti-apartheid movements around the world, the warfare states, do not recognize those fake Bantustans. do not collaborate with this idea that these propped up states are actually any kind of viable solution to a real liberation of the South African people. And I'm wondering if you can see a way in which this kind of the same perversive idea is also being used in the case of the Palestinian Authority and Palestine. That is recognition of not of Palestinians as subjects of their own liberation, but of this certain very perverse system.
Thank you. And then was there a relational question from anyone else? Okay. Then let's go with these two, and then we'll come back to you, right? Did you raise your name? Yeah. No?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Okay.
All right. So yes, I do recommend that we stop asking for statehood and take it back to the basics and just ask for freedom. Just freedom. Freedom for the Palestinians. I think that's a very, very, very clear thing, because it encapsulates all aspects of the Palestinian struggle. You know, it's saying that there is oppression and that we need to free people of oppression, right? And that freedom, in its shapes and forms, should be proposed by the Palestinians. And meanwhile, it's being proposed by a gang of what adjectives to use? Sellouts who are, you know, vested in their own interest, right? The Palestinian state. I mean, you can look at all the surveys done by independent Palestinian research institutions in Palestine, and the overwhelming majority, we're talking about more than 80%, do not want a two-state solution. This is the Palestinian voice. It's not being, fair enough, it's not being consolidated in a political project, but the overwhelming majority of Palestinians do not want a two-state solution, right? And the reason being is, I go back to what I said, it compromises the very essence of the Palestinian struggle, but more so it legitimizes Israel as a natural state. And to end with that, it's kind of also, you know, it's when you think about it, let's look at Germany, right? Germany says we accept the two-state solution, right? Or we push for the two-state solution, but then they don't accept the two-state solution and they don't vote for the ceasefire, right? It's like this European paradigm, which is what it is, proposed by Western governments, is really a paradigm that keeps you, you know, locked up. I mean, if you're proposing something and then you're not acting upon it, why am I begging you to do that? I mean, you're the one that proposed it, right? So why are you not following up? That has a lot of question marks. You know, it really kind of gets you thinking. If this is what you want, then why are you not recognizing Palestinian statehood, right? You're proposing this framework. And so it comes to show that it's just about, it's a facade, really, that allows and enables the state of Israel to continue committing crimes time and time over. So yes, that's me personally. I would say no, not statehood, just emancipation. Call for the freedom of Palestinians. Call for their liberation, right? And then it's on us, Palestinians, to tell you what that liberation looks like, right? But just ask for our liberation. Just ask that we are free. Yeah, so that's to address that. Lior, yeah, I mean that is a colonial construct, right? To create these Bantustans and to have these chiefs in all the Bantustans that you can talk to, that you give them, you support, you give them all these resources, and then they are doing the dirty work for the South African apartheid government at the time, and it's what's happening in the West Bank, right? Now the thing about South Africa is very similar to Palestine in many nuanced ways, but at the same time it's not, same but different. But what they were able to do in South Africa, which we haven't achieved yet, is they came up with 4 clear strategies or pillars for the struggle, right? They were very clear: civil disobedience, diplomacy and negotiations, international movement for anti-apartheid, and military struggle. And these were endorsed not only by political factions, but they were endorsed by football teams and by churches and by mosques and by all kinds of different movements, which made it so significant. So when they asked for one man, one vote, it was endorsed by everyone, right? And the tactics to achieve it were very clear for them, right? There are a lot of similarities. I mean, Israel was a major exporter of weaponry to the South African case, right? So yeah, so we have not yet come up with the one man, one vote framework for Palestinians, right? And I think that's where we should start working.
If I may just expand a bit on this, and then I'll give a mic to Anna and Rama. Did I see your hand?
Yeah, can I just add something onto that? Yeah, sorry, just one last thing. It's very interesting because, what happened when they, as Oslo was being drafted, also the South African apartheid was falling. But a lot of people in South Africa are saying that was never liberation, right? It was yes, there was now political rights, but the economic rights, wealth distribution remains heavily the same. The people that own the mines, the people that own all of the big industries are still white, right? They're still the Afrikaners. They're, you know what I mean? So people are like, people, even if there's a representation of the ANC as a black national movement, right? There's a saying in South Africa where they say, we killed the dragon, but we became the dragon. Right, and so that's why you have movements like the economic freedom fighters, right? And so it's very similar to Palestine, as I said, as a capitalist. When we're talking about state building, it's a super capitalist project, right? And so we don't want to replicate the South African experience, as a matter of fact.
I want to bounce off of too many things that you've said, but one of the things that made me think about the idea of the statehood and how it's both possible and impossible for Palestine is, the German example of how Germany will advocate for a two-state solution until the conditions are met. But the conditions will never be met because of the immaturity of Palestine to be a state. And that has always been a German positionality, so well adopted by a number of European governments. And so, those who are advocating two-state solution in Croatia or Serbia or Slovenia are often the ones who are really pulling off of the German political trajectory and the thought that Palestine will actually never be ready to be a state. At the same time, the state of Palestine that we only know of, but actually we don't, is that the 1995 Oslo Agreement and then the US from 2010 say that Palestine can only be a state under 4 conditions. One of them is no military of its own. Another one is no control of borders completely by Israel, no airspace, and no ministries, no ministries and infrastructure that is in or no ministries and governance that is in control of the infrastructure, medical and defense. And so that is the Oslo Agreement, and that is the 2010 U.S. suggestion. And so, the Republic of Slovenia recognized Palestinian state under these 4 conditions. And so this is what's happening. This is the wave of the recognition that's happening of that particular state. But I think, for us, it's really important to, take 2 things, or take the idea of freedom. Recently, when Amy Goodman was interviewing a dear comrade and probably well known to everyone, Noura Erakat from the U.S. American Palestinian lawyer, Amy asked, it was back in November, what is the solution now? And Noura said, freedom. And why is it so hard for everyone to imagine freedom? We are so caught in legal stuff, statehood, the recognition of this and that. Why is it so hard to think of freedom? It's not tangible, right? For us, as Maruška said, advocating the state is very radical in our context because of so much denial of the existence of Palestinians. So our good intention was to advocate for some sort of formation that is going to protect lives and give people some sort of political emancipation. I think we were not even aware of the fact that we are complicit in Zionist project and that we have not thought very often about how this is the extension I mean, I think we know, but we also don't know at the same time how this is extension of the European colonial project. But there are two things that we need to tell you, Majd, and I'm sure actually people can engage also in this analysis on a more deeper level. We have a legacy of the non-aligned movement here that was completely anti-colonial and decolonial, and the struggle that was happening in these spaces was the joint struggle with a number of African and Asian and so-called Middle Eastern countries that were fighting the colonial power. And so recognizing Palestine in that context after 1948 was not a question of the recognition itself. It was the Palestine who appeared at the table equally to every other entity that were mostly states, you know, nation states, federal states, whatnot. So the legacy of the non-aligned movement was we recognize Palestine because Palestine recognizes itself. It's here as a subject. And the other thing is that I think we're going to be talking about this in the panel after this, is that Kosovo and Bosnia, that are integral part of this region, don't have full sovereignty. They're being patronized and they're being patronates. And or semi, you know, some sort of creation, you know, colonial creation. There is some sort of governance above, and for many people in the movements across those two geographies or two countries and regional geographies, it is about we want full sovereignty. And some movements are actually thinking a lot about not only sovereignty related to state, but as, for instance, if I can jump to another geography, as Nick Cleese from the Red Natives of Minnesota says, sovereignty as my right to be on the land where I belong. It's not really about the borders and the state and the country that comes in this newly modern capitalism related way. It's about belonging to the land. And so sovereignty in that sense has an extended meanings too. Sorry, I don't know where I talked for too long now, but I just wanted to say that why did we advocate statehood so far, right?
That is actually runs to the.
I think we had Anna and Rama.
As the questions are being asked, but I also wanted to say something. It's very clear, I think, to everyone. I mean, let's be real. Like, we can't even stop a genocide from happening. Who's going to enforce Palestinian statehood when Israel's so against it? Let's be real. Like, what would that mean? What force on earth is going to make that happen? You know, and so yeah, this is just an offshoot kind of thought. But
we should just all create a project of abolition right now.
I want to come back to the regional liberation because it resonated with me a lot. And as you were talking, I was just recalling my memories in October, just last year, when the crowds went to the borders because they wanted to demolish the borders in Jordan. And it made me think about this movement of the crowds going to the borders, so not like protesting in the capital of Amman, but these crowds who precisely went to the borders, like we are fed up, we are going to the borders, maybe to dismantle the borders. I don't know, I was in Slovenia, not in Jordan, but this sparked this memory in my head, my recent memory from last year, and it also like made me curious about what you think about what is so known as the Black September in Jordan in the 70s, because it is a very controversial topic. It's not controversial from my perspective, but how we were getting educated in Jordan about it. It was like, it's a traitors, it was a trial, and all this discourse. But what we were discussing in my household, like with my parents, with my family, because my mother lived the whole experience, and my parents as well, and they described it to us differently. They described it to us that they were hiding the freedom fighters, the Palestinian freedom fighters. They were hiding them in their houses because it was not a civil war, as they taught us. It was a revolution to overthrow this dictatorial regime that was planted by the British Empire. What is your views on that? I'm very curious. And also, is there any traces or any sparks in our region that might already be happening, but we are not aware, or maybe we are like some sparks that is happening from the people to break free from this imperial state, nation, and nation states. And maybe one line or maybe fast view of how you perceive the Arab Spring. I know it is a very hard one, I know, and it's very controversial, but like, was it just putting us in the loop again, or at least the spark of it? Any dimension from this lens? Thank you.
No, thank you. I think you completed the question with the answer. There's two levels for this that I would reflect with you on. The first is, yes, there was a threat to the newly established state of Jordan, right? There was a threat to the government in place, which, as you described, was a government that is there also to fulfill the interests of a wider, the wider colonial Western capitalist project. Let's not forget that Jordan was the first to sign peace treaties in Egypt. Jordan practically has Israel's back geographically, right? It's literally Israel's backbone, right? From Asia, from the rest of Asia, right? And as we saw, throughout the last 10 months, Jordan's interests have been aligned with protecting Israel, right? In many senses, whether it was quelling the protests that were occurring, the repression of the protesters that was ongoing in Ramadan at the time, whether it was the shooting down of the rockets or whatever, whether it was allowing the military, the American military, to operate freely in its airspace, or whether it's the providing of the land. What would you call it? The supplying Israel through land with food and whatever, because the Houthis blocked the Red Sea, right? So in that sense, it's very clear what the political makeup, right, or DNA of the governance of Jordan is. Right, and so in this case, it's very, it makes complete sense that in Black September, that was the narrative that they put through, because there was a threat to the Jordanian sovereignty at the time. But it was indeed, as your mom described it, it was something revolutionary. It was one of the first battles, Karam, it was one of the first battles where actually Palestinian resistance had some kind of success, right? And with that being said, I think the other level, and I want to allow myself to be a bit critical, one of the big faults or flaws of the PLO was that it didn't make it clear that it wasn't a threat, right? The PLO was made up of different political factions, heavily Fatah at the time, and they were all guerrilla movements. It was all militant groups, and there was no it was all representation based on who was the strongest in terms of its military, and it was also very self-consumed. So even when it left Jordan into Beirut, it was still very self-consumed with itself as the representative of the Palestinian people. There was a lot of internal strife between it, which was one of its shortcomings, actually, because suddenly it was about being present and being a force wherever they were, as opposed to continuing the fight or continuing the militant fight against the state of Israel. So that's on the one front, and the other front, it's. When the Arabs, in terms of their populations, have been severely numbed, but not out of their own making, right? The states are super repressive. I mean, look at Egypt. The amount of prisoners that they have is just mad, right? Academics, thinkers, journalists, etc. Everyone that could be a threat is in the worst prisons ever, similar to Saudi. They have all of anyone that was influential, that goes against the state, anyone that just put a post against is locked up, and there's no freedom of that. And I think one of the biggest trauma experiences that we have is actually the Arab Spring. It failed in Egypt, it failed in Syria, It failed in all these different places, and that left such a bitter taste in people's mouth, and it gave them something to fear, right? They have that traumatic experience in their head, and they're like, where did our sacrifice go? Egypt is worse than it was under Mubarak, right? And so I do think, and I think also the fact that, you know, this is a side quest. I think also the change of technology and the fact that, you know, everyone's today on social media and there's this individualized relationship also takes a lot of agency from people, you know, because they feel like, you know, there's nothing that represents us collectively, and, you know, it's just me and this screen, and so you don't see the same movements, you know. So yeah, I think the analysis of that we're all aware of, and it's very unfortunate, and that's why no one is waiting, in a sense, for the Arabs to move, you know, sadly.
Anna, Rama, and then we might have time for one more question.
Thank you, Majd, for presenting these ideas. This is making me think a lot and question so many things. I'm interested to hear about your vision of what the opposite of statehood would look like, and to try to think together, or you think, and give us your vision so we can, so it could make a bit more sense, to me at least. And my other question is, I keep thinking about the consequences of this. So if we go that way and we push towards something other than statehood, but the whole world is still going in that direction, what the how bad the consequences are going to be, and would it harm us instead of benefit us? And is it correct to be going in that direction now, or should we wait until we have, I don't know, more rights or more power, and then, or like, until we liberate ourselves and then we get to choose what it would look like? We liberate Palestine, free Palestine, and then we can think about how we want our lives to be then. Because I'm terrified of this doing an opposite effect and harming us instead of benefiting us, because this is the common idea amongst people around the world. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So like, if we start saying that, oh, maybe this isn't the best way to liberate Palestine, we would probably lose momentum, and we would have to build from scratch again. And that terrifies me. So thoughts on this? Shukran.
Oh, thank you. So statehood is not proposed from the river to the sea, right? It's proposed only in the West Bank and Gaza, or even some localities of that, right? And from there, you know, I don't know how much harm could be done. You know, I think we have reached the apex of how, you know, it's gonna, as I said earlier, it's gonna get worse. But I don't. We're already like in such a messed up situation. It's already super bad, and I don't know how much more harm could be done if we switch. You know, and the other thing I would say is, for any liberation, we need to be the active agents of proposing it. So in that sense, sorry, but F the world. Like, I don't, you know, like I am the one that wants to decide what my freedom looks like, you know, and it brings me to, yes, we Palestinians have a massive responsibility. You know, if there was internal strife, whether it's in 48 or whether it's in the West Bank, that's a whole game changer. That we won't need anyone anymore because it's internally now disrupted, right? And that would be a massive change in the whole equation, right? So we have way more power than we think, but we've been trained and programmed to think that we are passive victims, and we need to change that mentality, right? And so, no, I don't think we should let the world choose what liberation is to us. I don't think it's going to get any better. You know, no one's coming to save us. 76 years have showed us that. And I think we need to be the active agents for our liberation to begin with, right? And to address the first question, you know, I think there's way more brighter minds that can come up with economically what it would look like, or govern in terms of governance what that would look like, etc. But I think we can draw on multiple or take inspiration from multiple different models around the world, more recent, more modern, and even before. So just, I mean, look at the states, right? There's a federal government, right? There's different states, and then there's a federal kind of over supra-regional structure, if you may, that regulates certain affairs of the entirety of all these states. You can look at Switzerland with its different cantons, right, where each locality has certain autonomy to regulate its own affairs, and so on and so forth. And we can look at city-states. What would it mean to have some kind of overarching system in all this region? And then each, there's city-states all across it, right, that regulate their own affairs, but they benefit from this overall region with its resources, its wealth, and et cetera, its safety and security, et cetera. And I say this also to make it clear that I am very, very cautious of not calling it the Arab world either, because I also don't want to recycle nationalist identities, and I don't want to create a one-size-fits-all for everyone. I mean, in the way I imagine it, of course. And so it's not about ethnic identities anymore as much as it's about this diversity that can exist, be it ethnic, be it regional, be it whatever it may be, right? And so yes, we can think about, like, at least the way I imagine it is what would it mean to have, different city-states or different districts that have their own kinds of autonomous regulation of these spaces, and an overarching kind of governance system that is not concerned with the affairs of each locality. So it's no longer about minority rights or collective rights. It's about how each place can be regulated based on a wider set of values or principles that regulate all of these affairs, but then each city-state or each district has its own kind of autonomous regulation. Again, yeah.
If I'm understanding correctly, is what you're describing, if I'm understanding correctly, is the merging of countries to the way they were before colonization, and then every city will be responsible for themselves, or like making their own rules, taking care of each other under some sort of a list of main laws that they can work with as they go?
Yeah, more or less, and they would all be under some supranational governments, right? So there would be, in my imagination, one entity from Mashriq to Maghrib, and within that there's different localities that serve their own interest, but it's not based on ethnicity or race or culture. It's not the Arab world, it's not the Jewish state, it's not the Sharkas, it's not Amazigh. These are identities that you keep for yourself, but they are not the driver, they're not the launching place of governance.
Then what is it? Where do we draw the line? Is it the whole world? Or what?
We can start with the microcosm and maybe influence other people to think of taking agency over creating their own structures.
Tomorrow is Sunday, and whoever is staying in Ljubljana could maybe meet up and work on this idea, and maybe draw on both literature and practices that exist. A lot of the I think many people that we work with are currently engaged in the movements around abolition of border and nation states across Latin America, North America. Even comrades in Kashmir are trying to, decolonize from Indian colonization, and are suggesting different ways of living and different ways of political organizing their community. I feel like there are a lot of different examples that we could follow, but Majd, what you're suggesting is, of course, utopistic. It's a huge utopian idea, but in the vein of, being in a space where we are craving for radical popular political education and creating radical or allowing ourselves radical imagination, I feel like we should be opening that space to radically imagine and co-create the possible projects or the possibilities of abolition and non-creation of the state, but something else, some other formations. That's a huge challenge.
I mean, that's why I base it in imagination, right?
Yes.
And that's why I say it's instigating people to think of living otherwise, right? This is not something that happens overnight. This is something, and it can take many shapes and forms. And I think I'm saying it without saying it, but like that would mean the end of the world as we know it, right? Yeah. It would literally mean the rearrangement of the international system. And I realize how, I wouldn't call it utopian because it's real. It can happen, it can manifest, but it's definitely
Utopia
something like, it's massive.
Yes. Okay, Auron, and then we had two more hands here. I saw yours, and I saw yours, and I think we're going to have to close. Anna and Auron over there, okay. That's 4 people. We have another panel at 8. I'm just being mindful of time.
Okay, so just to, so I would not let this exact last topic escape. We talked about when we met, actually, but we didn't continue the conversation. This concept of abandoning state and also creating a non-capitalist society is not utopic, especially right now. You have very close to Palestine, the Kurds in East Turkey and also in northern Syria, which are doing exactly this. They are very much empowered by their thinker, Abdullah Öcalan, which is a political prisoner in Turkey and which governed a party and a militant struggle for liberation of the Kurds. In his beginnings, he saw it that we should create this state for Kurds, which is called Kurdistan. But later, throughout his years and throughout the struggle, they learned that that is exactly this. It's an European colonialist project in the end. It's an European Western idea that is implemented on their colonized nations. So they came up with this idea that of community, of communal-based governorship. They have this. They are trying to basically implement this in northern Syria. It's relatively unknown because of their. They were known when they were fighting ISIS in the war, basically from 2014. But recently, today, they have started to develop these communes that govern themselves. They make the decision making on a communal level. They do the discussion on a communal level. Their representations are 50 to 50% women and men. And there is this very much progressive and very much grassroots power to the people there. And I think we should, when we say we are going to get creative, we shouldn't again think of Switzerland or think of nation states in Europe, but to get creative on that region. And you as a previous speaker said, do we see something in the region? Yes, we definitely do. And I think that's the way to go. It's a very much anti-capitalist concept which fights capitalist modernity in a way that it doesn't allow us to fall into this false promise of a statehood, which then also, again, we'll see that it will be just a proxy to serve the US interest and the EU interest, but to actually give power to the people. And I think we really must explore the alternatives from the region and from the colonized regions, as we say. We also have a similar concept being developed in Mexico, for example, with the Zapatistas. So I think those two are very much something we can develop on and think of it in seriously, especially even in Palestine and Palestinians among themselves.
Yeah, I just want to tell him that it was very enriching, actually, and I would have to admit my I would say my ignorance about the Kurdish struggle on that level, and I completely agree. Maybe it fell in the cracks about Switzerland, but you're absolutely right. I'm not trying to draw inspiration from them, but it's more about what would it what modern things look like. But thank you for that. I will definitely. It's very, very inspired to go and learn more about it. Thank you.
Same, Mauron. Thank you for this. Just a recommendation for everyone. A beautiful book, Purple Color of Kurdish Politics, has come out recently. It was written by Kurdish women in Turkish prisons, and they actually draw on the idea of communal governorship. It was translated by another comrade, feminist translator, Emek Ergun, so you can read it in English. And maybe we translate it in the Doberdanski languages too. We had two more questions. No, I'm sorry, Anna, I keep forgetting you, sorry.
That's okay. So thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate the imagination part, because I think that's so lacking everywhere today. People are very quick to throw their hands up to the status quo. But I did want to get your analysis on the landscape of the resistance and its conceptions of statehood right now, because recently there was the talks between various factions, Palestinian factions, and there's a lot of differences there, right, too, on statehood recognizing Israel or trying to get, a partitioned part of Palestine. And I've read some analysis around using the partition part of Palestine as a step, or even the having one democratic state as a step towards liberation, but not the final goal. So I was just wondering on what is your take on that? Could it ever be a step, even the one democratic state, or you just kind of reject that? I'm just curious.
I mean, do I take another question?
Yeah, let's do that. I'm just a little anxious about time. Yeah. Could we take these two questions here, and then we're going to wrap up the talk. Thanks, Nina. A woman with glasses. Oh, next to another. Thank you, first of all, for opening up this conversation.
I can just... Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's just continuation of what you already talked about, and some of the things were answered, some of the things maybe cannot be answered in this room, but I was thinking a lot about nationalism and the catalyzing power it has had in different parts of the world and colonized areas. And we just have internalized capitalism and the notion of state that I feel it's really difficult, at least for me, to go beyond that and imagine what could be that alternative catalyzing power. Because of course, maybe we do need that common identity, what connects us, because after all, a Palestinian, that is also not a super clear cut category. So just thinking about dismantling colonial ideas and fighting for freedom for all, but also not losing yourself in the scheme of this project, how to maintain in concrete and not to go in the same colonial concepts.
And then there was you wanted,
thank you very much for what you were saying, and I just wanted to maybe reflect very shortly that you are very right to actually point to the point of freedom. And why? Because it was, I think, 20 years ago, very important writings in Africa regarding what we actually experienced afterwards, very palpably with the refugees. And the theory was, that was theory, but actually it was not just a theory, that when you face death, you can only ask for freedom. You don't ask for the normative elements of state, constitution, and so on. And I remember it was really, it seemed very utopian, but it came back. And the other point was that those who live like we in European context, European Union, we practically more or less, we who thinks we are citizens. We don't see every day, we are not in the proximity of death, but we are in proximity of different elements of violence. And then we ask for democracy. But when you see in the proximity of death, you really ask for freedom. And I thought it's very, very interesting that what we then experience with the refugees, and now with the brutalities, this incredible situation, horrible horror in Gaza and in the, what's going on, I thought it's really wonderful that you point this out. I just wanted to make a comment because it was this dilemma how we can ask for freedom and who can ask for freedom. I think we cannot ask for freedom, but you are absolutely right to do this.
Just a short comment and thank you. Actually, it's kind of like follow up on what you just said and very close to, but also like something. You are in the region now. You will spend here 3 months, and there is quite a lot to learn from the region. Not all of the countries in this region are European Union, but we are Europe. Not all the countries in this region are free, even though we are in the middle of the Europe. But there is one example that, and also one country here, and it will be nice that we all dream together and to find solutions together. You can learn a lot from the Kosovo example. Kosovo went through apartheid that nobody talks about. And it was not apartheid that lasted 1, 2, 3 years, but it lasted for quite a long time. It was very difficult. And people in Kosovo went through very difficult struggle, which ended up with genocide and a war, and then they got the statehood. They are free now, but that statehood and that freedom is very expensive, to put it in that way. And now they are dealing with different kind of issues, with different kind of struggles. So maybe it's interesting for you to look into this Kosovo, which is often forgotten in international level, but Kosovo is really, really interesting. When you talk about the solutions, like you mentioned, Switzerland and these kind, be very careful, because they will give you Dayton Peace Agreement, and that's the end of you. That's the end of everything. We have that. That's a peace agreement which was reached to stop the war in Bosnia, and they created something like this that you are talking about, but that's not solution. That's a bigger hell. Honestly, for me, it's a bigger hell than the war, and I survived the war. I would rather go back to war. But at this moment, I really think that all what we can dream about, or that we have to pray for and hope for, and you said that, it's not freedom, it's a peace. I just stop the genocide, and then we will be able to go through all this. Otherwise, we can't, because they kill our dreams. They're killing our dreams. They're killing people who would be able to dream and to create something. So I really think, but that's for us. That's not for you. We have to scream, to fight. Not you. You're doing your best, but we have to stop this because we are responsible. Even though I'm from Bosnia and I'm not responsible for anything, I'm like just a bullshit country and around the corner. But I'm here, and as a survivor, I really think we should stop talking about anything else and demand this horrible horror to stop. And then together we should kind of like take spaces where we can dream together. And I quote Lenin always, yeah, dreaming is one of our basic human rights. So let's dream together. And I really hope we can find solution that is no borders, no states, and all this. And then but we have to do it together. Not your region, but all of us together, and just abolish all this bullshit that we are living in at the moment.
No, I'm good. I'm never using the example of Switzerland ever again. Ever. Like, that's just not happening. It was like shooting myself in the foot. Never again. Never again. So I'm not doing that. Yeah, I'm very fortunate to be here and learn, from these different experiences. And thank you for pointing out, the details that you did point out. I think while it is peace that we're looking for, the immediate thing is very true that what I'm talking about is the longer term work that needs to be done. The immediate work that needs to be done, I think, is clear and should be further accumulated and amplified, which is disruption. Disrupt the given context. And to go back to the comrade, to Lior's comment about South Africa, that's the only way South Africa was ever able to move forward, because they disrupted the economy, they disrupted the normalcy of life internally, but also abroad. So yes, that is the work that we should immediately work on, right? Disrupt normalcy. I think that's the only way we can ever get to a ceasefire, unless, you know, there's some major power that says, oh, I'm going to cut off the oil or something like that, which I don't think will happen. I appreciate your comment about freedom and about, yeah, it's actually a life and death. It's a survivalist thing, you know, when you want to be free of the oppression. So I highly appreciate that. For the question about, what was the question there? Sorry. Yeah.
So how can we be concrete about envisioning?
Right. Yeah, and so what I wanted to say is it starts, as was said there, in microcosms. We should start practicing and drafting what these social contracts mean to us in a way that is not based on nation states. So it's not about, the theorizing only becomes real when it's praxis, right? When we merge whatever ideology that we're dabbling with in practice, right? So it starts with smaller, you know, microcosms, places practicing otherwise, and that goes hand in hand with disruption. So it's a rejection of the given mode of operation or the daily life, but it's also proposing an otherwise, right? So to also mention some things, chaos is the easiest thing to be done, and chaos doesn't work in our favor, right? We should have a map of what we want the day after. Chaos is I think we've had a conversation about, it's the easiest thing to go right now and burn tires and close roads, and it really is, right? But that hijacks, because a lot of, if it's unguided, then it's just destructive, right? And so I think before we attempt to do any of these experiments, any experiment locally in drafting social, we should be very aware of what sustenance, prosperity, security looks like for us, and so that we're not just kind of making a statement about nationhood, but no, finding another way of living and enforcing it, and you know, even if it takes sacrifice, but it's still viable and functional for wherever that place is. And to finish with the question about resistance, I want to say that's actually that was actually the Achilles heel, if you may, of Oslo, right? That's what Yasser Arafat said. Oh, let's just get back, and then we'll think about, you know, let's first get a little piece of the land, just go back there, and then, you know, we'll liberate all of it, and we'll trick them. We'll say that we recognize you, and then we'll get up our power, and we'll take it back. And 30 years later, look where we are, right? And I want to say that also resistance in Palestine is a survivalist thing right now, right? So the Jenin brigades, for example, the resistance fighters in Jenin, it's survivalist to them. You're coming here, we're defending the camp, right? You've killed my dad, you've imprisoned my brother, you've demolished my cousin's house. It's personal to them, right? It's very personal, and it's not motivated by some a meta political project, right? So I've interviewed some of them, and it's like, okay, so what are we fighting for, right? Beyond this, and it's like, I'm like, what does liberation look like to you? And it's like, oh, to free the Aqsa Mosque, and I'm like, great, but how does that look like? And it's like, to have a khilafah, and I'm like, okay, fine, but what does that look like? And there is no vision of that. So for many of the resistance fighters, it's about defense, especially in the West Bank, right? Now, Gaza is also about survival. Siege, 17 years, starvation, hunger, you know, and all of it, right? So, and it's true that we say that it was the first, it wasn't a reaction, but it was, we initiated, or Hamas initiated, Qassam brigades, they initiated it, but in many senses it is a reaction, right? And even Hamas itself, when you listen to Sinwar and all of them, they're like, okay, if you recognize 67 borders, we'll recognize 67 borders. They're pretty blatant about that. But they realize that will never happen. They understand it. It's very clear to them, right? So they're like, okay, you want to do that? You want by the way, they do say that. You want a two-state solution? We're down, right? All right, we double down, actually. We're cool with that. We'll recognize the state of Israel. But that won't happen. They understand it, right? They understand it, right? And so on that level, up until now, the thing guiding resistance is survival. It's survival, right? It's not following some kind of ideal like the one I'm proposing, right? It's about living free on the ground in practice, right? Which is the most noble, if you ask me, ways to fight back. They have no other, it's either that or to be killed, to be gone, to be ethnically cleansed. So there's no choice, and that's what resistance is today. Yeah, and I think that's it. So yeah, Palestinians will be free everywhere that they might be. Thank you.